Hi, everybody. This is Zen Honeycutt from Moms Across America. I'm very excited to have Dr. Mark Pettus. He is the medical director at Functional Formularies. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Zen. How are you?
Thank you for being on. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to our viewers today. You're the director of medical education and population health at Functional Formularies, and you're at the Berkshire Health Systems in Western Massachusetts. You live in Pittsfield, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
you're a dad of two kids. I shouldn't say kids, adult children now. One is 26. She's a school teacher. And then you have a son, Alex, who's professed a Zen master, you say. He's always in the moment, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You have some very special kids, and we're very glad to have you on today. You just did a great webinar this morning about the restoring the microbes in the gut for Functional Formularies. Today is March 22nd, and you can find this webinar on functionalformularies.com under continuing education. And we're very glad that you did this webinar because it was geared towards physicians and healthcare providers, correct?
Yes.
And what was exciting to me is that so many physicians and healthcare providers are interested in this subject now. It really is revolutionary. I mean, most of our moms say that when they go to the doctor or when their parents go to the doctor who might have cancer or some type of health issue, the doctors just say, no, it's not related to food, it's genetic, right?
Right.
This is how it's been for decades.
Yes.
And there's a new emerging awareness about the microbiome in the gut, which is the bad and good gut bacteria, which I'm sure you'll give us a whole overview of this. And I just love that you are addressing this and that you have a growing audience. Would you say that your audience is growing? Would you say that there's more and more awareness in the medical field?
Yeah, I think there's no question, Zen. This is one of the most rapidly growing areas of research now in the world. And while there are still a lot more questions and answers, it's clear that this ecosystem that is very much a part of who we are as human beings is shaping a huge influence on our health and our longevity. Every aspect of our lives is probably in some way being influenced by this ecosystem.
Wow. And why would that be? In the beginning of your webinar, you talked about an emerging new world order. I mean, this really sounds dramatic. Why is it why is the microbiome such a big deal? And what's been happening in our world to have this be a whole new topic?
Yeah, well, as you alluded to, Zen, historically, we've thought that most diseases were largely genetic and that you would come into the world predestined to have a particular disease that may have run in your family. And while there's some truth to that, much of the research over the last, I'd say 5 years in particular, very recent, is suggesting that lifestyle, how we eat, how we move, how we sleep, how we interpret and respond to stress in our lives, how socially connected we are, how much love we cultivate, in our work, love and play, that all of these lifestyle attributes are actually interacting with our DNA, what we call epigenetics. Mm-hmm. So we're rapidly moving from this historical understanding that how long we live and how well we live is genetic and we have no influence over that, to an understanding that the genetics may put us at risk, but it's lifestyle and the compatibility of that lifestyle that will determine how those genes express themselves. We call that epigenetics. It's a much more dynamic, malleable relationship that really gives people, I believe, possibilities throughout their lives to profoundly change the trajectory of health and wellness that they're on. The most recent addition to this new world order, as I would think about it, which I think, and you use the word revolutionized, I don't think that's an understatement. Human biology, I think, is totally and radically transforming itself when you add the microbiome, which essentially is this community of microorganisms, mostly bacteria, but there are some viruses, there may be some what we call fungi. They live mostly in our guts, in our colon, our large intestine. They live in our skin. They live in our mouths. Historically, we thought these were just critters sort of coming along for the ride. Now what we are realizing is that the quality of this ecosystem, and by quality, Zen, I'm referring to, like most ecosystems, how diverse the ecosystem is. Is there a large representation of these organisms? Mm-hmm. And how balanced the ecosystem is? Is the representation of these 1,000, 2,000 organisms as we currently understand balanced, equally represented? What we're now realizing is that these are not just critters coming along for the ride. These are critters that are fundamentally a part of who we are as human beings. We are a composite organism. Zen honeycut is probably 95% bacteria.
Wow.
It's kind of mind-boggling.
For OCD people, that could, occur as a problem. They could be breaking out the bleach and the antibacterial. So that could really sort of raise a lot of concerns. But what you're saying is that these microbiomes are good guys. Many of them are very good guys.
Yes, as it turns out, most of them probably are good guys, Zen. And there would be a risk for anyone who might be a little germophobic, as I have been throughout my life, to confront what is a very different paradigm. For many reasons, our food supply, for example, eating more processed foods, eating foods that have more pesticide residues, getting more antibiotics throughout our lives, getting antibiotics from foods that we eat, antibiotics that are given to these feedlot cattle, poultry. When we eat those foods, we get some of those antibiotics in our system. More kids that are coming into the world by cesarean section. Most of this ecosystem we get when we are delivered vaginally. And the flora from mom and dad, to some extent, is very much colonized as we come into the world that way. If you come into the world by cesarean section, you have an entirely different ecosystem of flora. If you are bottle fed as opposed to breastfed, and I'm not making judgment statements, there are many potentially life-saving reasons why C-section may be chosen, or there may be many compelling reasons why a mom might choose to bottle feed as opposed to breastfeed. But we know that nature, vaginal deliveries, breastfeeding, eating foods that are not processed are ideal for the cultivation and maintenance of this ecosystem. And so for many reasons, some of which I touched on, we've lost that legacy. So if you look at the ecosystem of the average American, there are far fewer organisms. Instead of seeing 1,500, 2,000 different types of bacteria, you might see 500, a much smaller fraction. And when you look at that smaller fraction, you will have some organisms that are much more overrepresented than what historically was likely to be the case. And I can get into the names if that would be of interest. But the point is that we've lost our diversity and we've lost our balance. And we're just now in 2017 coming to appreciate the ways in which this is fueling health, whether you're dealing with autism spectrum at the early end of the continuum or cancer and Alzheimer's disease on perhaps the older end of the age continuum, and everything in between.
Well, it's very exciting that you're bringing this up and that medical doctors across the country and around the world are paying attention, because this could be a huge turn in the tide for health issues in America, which are skyrocketing, and of course around the world. You've mentioned that you've been in the medical field for 30 years. So for you to say that this is revolutionary and to agree that this is a big deal. You have experience in this field. And one of your focuses is on population health. And it's pretty clear that our population in America, with 1 out of 2 children having a chronic illness now, 1 out of 2 males and 1 out of 3 females expected to get cancer. 1 out of 5 Americans with mental illness. Clearly, there is something going on here. And it's not genetic, because you wouldn't have that many people all of a sudden being sick due to genetics, because there's no historical history for that. So obviously there's something else going on here, and you're touching upon the microbiome being the source of this. We just broke some news today, and if you don't mind, I'm going to screen share and sort of get your perspective a little bit on this, because we know here in America that the health is not good. We're in a health crisis. But we would expect that in other countries it would be better, because we have, just a little bit of background. We have 85% of our processed foods. You mentioned processed foods for pregnant mothers to avoid that. 85% of our processed foods contains GMOs in America, genetically modified organisms, most of which have been genetically engineered to withstand glyphosate-based herbicides, considering Roundup. And you did mention glyphosate in your webinar. I was very happy about that. So this is something that we really have to take notice of, and we were thinking that health here in America, because we eat the most GMOs, we eat the most processed foods, that our health is going to be the worst around the world. But I found something quite different when I went to Japan recently, and I'm going to share that image with you now. So you can see here in the left chart, in the pink and the red, it's the prevalence rate of autism and pervasive developmental disorders in different countries: Denmark, Australia, Canada, Sweden, the United States, UK, Japan, and Korea. Look at the rates here in Japan and Korea. They're 2 to 3 times higher than in the US. And then if you look over here at the agrochemical usage per unit area, whether this is acre or not, it looks like kilometer. You're looking at, in the US, you have much lower levels than in Japan and Korea, which is correlate to the autism and developmental disorders. I also have to say Philippines is not on this chart, but I spoke directly to the moms, and you can see here in our blog, which is on Moms Across America, that according to the Autism Society in the Philippines, at least 1 million, or 1 out of 3 children in the Philippines were diagnosed with autism in 2014. That's twice as high as the rate in the US. So as somebody that looks at population health, what would you say about this?
Well, I think epidemiologists, which is aligned with sort of population health thinking, population health largely being, how can you create communities that support healthier behaviors that we know ultimately drive most of the chronic complex disease that has formed the epidemic that you allude to then. So population health is largely about how do you transform your systems, communities, systems of care, social capital to address these issues. When you look at epidemiology, it's the correlations between the increasing use of environmental toxins, and while we still have incomplete understanding of what the true burden of cause and effect is, the epidemiology is clear that the burden of environmental toxins we use, I think in the example that you gave, these were pesticide, agricultural toxin. And we know that many pesticides, herbicides, and glyphosate as an herbicide, utilization around the world has gone up dramatically. And coincident with that, we see these correlations of much higher incidence and prevalence of these developmental diseases. When you look at the mechanisms as we understand them, we know that many environmental toxins will certainly affect DNA. We talked a little bit about epigenetics. So we know that if someone has a genetic predisposition, the environment that they are in may significantly make more likely they will express that risk. But we know that it's much bigger than that. We know that many environmental toxins will affect the microbiome. Glyphosate is an example. It has antibiotic-like activity. It interferes with some key metabolic pathways of these microorganisms. And by extrapolation, and one has to extrapolate because some of that data is still lacking, it certainly seems clear that on a mechanistic level, one can easily point to environmental toxins as one of what are probably many influences on these skyrocketing epidemics all around the world. And I think Asia and China and Japan, a generation ago, diabetes was rare in China. Now it's an epidemic.
Yeah.
So these things are exploding. We know that a lot of it has to do with foods and the quality of foods. Many of these areas are now becoming westernized. So they're eating more processed foods. They're migrating away from many of the ancestral ways of living. If you look at Okinawa, Japan, it's an island. Mm-hmm. Okinawa, Japan is called a blue zone, which essentially these people live very long lives and they have a very low prevalence of Western disease. If you contrast that to the main island of Japan, they live a much more modern Western life. So there's an example of a country within a country where an island that has been protected from many of these westernized changes has maintained the health and longevity that we would all like to see, while others are beginning to experience these epidemics of chronic complex disease. So environmental toxins, changes in our food supply, if you look at so many other aspects of whether it's sleep deprivation or the stress that we confront, we know that all of these factors together are creating the perfect storm. And it's scary when you look at how it can affect you even before conception. Epigenetics would suggest that how mom and dad choose in the many months prior to conceiving their future child will have a great deal of influence on that child's health. So what we inherit are not just the genes that kind of put us at risk or not. We inherit the environmental and social conditions within which we were conceived. And that can be passed from one generation to the next from some of the research. It's fascinating work. And we come back to this place, Zen, that lifestyle in many ways can begin to alter these factors significantly. And I think for me, that's where the hope is from a population health perspective and certainly from an individual self-care perspective.
Yeah, that's the point that we want to get across. This sounds like a lot of bad news. I mean, definitely, 2 to 3 times higher rates of autism and developmental delays in an area which we would typically think of as having a healthier diet. They have a lot of fermented foods. They have a lot of fish. You would think that they would be healthier, but you add in these agrochemicals and other factors, I'm sure as well, industrial chemicals, and you can see that their rates their health issues around autism and developmental delays are much higher. So this is a great concern. However, the good news is that we can do something about it. It's not written in stone genetically that this is the way it has to continue to be. We can do something about it. I personally, in my son, within 6 weeks, saw a complete recovery of autism symptoms that never came back. And, from eating organic, addressing the gut, putting in fermented foods, colloidal silver, not eating any sugar, not feeding the microbiome, the bad gut bacteria, and just paying attention to the gut, a lot of greens, a lot of organic foods. I mean, all organic foods, but a lot of greens and more whole foods. So, and as I'm sure you recommend that to your patients as well, I do want to touch upon one more thing. We're going to have to wrap up pretty soon, but in your webinar, you say that 75% of the American diet does not benefit the microbiome. So can you give us just a few minutes of what are the foods that don't benefit the microbiome and what happens when you eat too much of those? And what are the foods that do benefit the microbiome and what benefits can we see from that?
Because so much of our modern diet is processed, Zen. The processing strips those foods from fiber. Fiber, we are now appreciating, is the most important food for the microbiome, for the gut. So the more fiber we get in our diet, particularly from plant-based foods, the more we feed our gut bacteria, the more diverse and the more balanced it becomes. The average American today probably consumes less than 15 grams of fiber per day. Our ancient ancestors, it is estimated, or if you look at ancestral people today, the Papua New Guineans, the Australian Aborigines, the Hadza in East Africa, they probably consume 80 to 100 plus grams of fiber per day from diverse arrays of plant-based foods. So processing has stripped that out of the foods that we eat. Now, if you look at what are largely carbohydrates, flour-based foods, sugar, they promote overgrowth of some of these strains of bacteria that become less healthy for us. And that overgrowth deprives the healthier strains of bacteria from maintaining adequate balance. What we're learning is that that tends to activate our immune system, what we would call inflammation. And whether you're dealing with autism or depression or heart disease or Alzheimer's, those are inflammatory conditions. So processed foods, particularly those that are flour-based, we call them carbohydrate-dense, leads to a very different balance and inflammatory expression, as opposed to whole foods, particularly plant-based foods, where the fermentable fiber, and this could be in fruits, it could be in most vegetables, it could be in beans, legumes. These are powerhouse foods for promoting the growth and diversity of the microbiome. And indeed, epidemiologically, when you look at places that consume very little processed, flour-based, carbohydrate-dense foods with more plant-based foods, you see very different prevalences of Western disease. So these are some of the trends that I think are really emerging as opportunities for us as caregivers and in our own sort of stewardship of self-care to more consciously think about how being a human in a modern environment requires us to choose more wisely, because many of the things in our environment are foreign to us. They may not feel foreign because we've had them around us all our lives, but from an evolutionary biologic perspective, these are new to nature foods that I think for many of us are wreaking havoc with our health.
Yeah, thank you very much for touching on that. So more fiber, more whole foods, definitely organic food, right? Because you could be eating all kinds of vegetables and they could be sprayed with 52 different pesticides. That's not going to help your microbiome. That's actually going to throw off an imbalance, right? Correct?
Yeah, absolutely, Zen. I think anytime one can choose organic, particularly for the dirty dozen, I often refer people to the Environmental Working Group, ewg.org. There are some fruits and vegetables that have extraordinarily high pesticide residues, the dirty dozen. Going organic for those is critical. Eating organic in general is a good idea, but for the dirty dozen, it's particularly helpful. And then when you look at genetic modification, and so much of the discussion with GMO is around, are there differences in the nutrient? In my view, it's less that and more this glyphosate Roundup issue and how that as a toxin and those residues can impact many aspects of our health. And then I think, we know that there are some foods that are organic that might still have some traces of glyphosate in them. Glyphosate is being used as a browning agent. So many things like oats and rye, many grains will be sprayed with glyphosate to accelerate their maturity so they can be harvested in a shorter timeline, maybe before the rains come in. So when you look at glyphosate levels, when they are measured, and they're not often measured routinely, in many of those grain-based foods, they are extraordinarily high. So I think that for the consumer, it is a bit more challenging, but organic and avoiding GMO whenever you can is definitely a wise thing to do.
That's great. Thank you for saying that. That is the easiest way. I know I don't like to memorize a whole long list. I do want to say for the record, I don't agree with the Environmental Working Group list that they include corn as one of the safe foods to eat. I know that there's a husk and you can peel it off, but I just don't trust the fact that there is GMO corn that is sprayed with glyphosate as a drying agent, and sweet corn that's GMO has been recorded to be sold. Walmart has admitted selling that. So I would avoid corn at all costs unless it's organic, no conventional corn at all. So, and I always say that to the moms too, that the number one things you want to start to avoid in going organic is grain, because the highest levels that we are seeing are on wheat and garbanzo beans, which is in hummus.
Yes.
Most people wouldn't expect that you would have to buy organic hummus. And so for the dietitians that are out there, or the health practitioners that are advising their patients, instead of a burger, have pita bread with hummus, you're actually advising them to poison themselves with very high levels of glyphosate. We really have to rethink how we are advising, patients, or, dietitians advising their clients, or whichever, because grains are the highest level. And then dairy, so any milk or cheese you eat would be best to have that organic, and then eggs, and then of course any of the berries and things. I do agree with the environmental working group on the other, some of the other foods on there that are cleaner, but berries in particular, and fruit, apples, are very high in pesticides. We want to avoid those. So thank you for your information, Dr. Pettus. You have a lot more information. If you want to get into the nitty gritty, you want to see what's really going on, you want to hear more details about the microbiome, you want to share this with your health practitioner, please do go to functionalformularies.com and go to continuing education. And Dr. Mark Pettus will be back with us again, I think, right, in the next couple of months with some more webinars. And we really appreciate that you're making this available. Also, if you are a health practitioner and you want to get credit, right, for this webinar, there is an accreditation towards your degree as well. So please contact Functional Formularies about that. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today. Really is a revolutionary conversation for health practitioners and for moms. We're the number one health practitioner in our family, right?
Moms rock, totally.
Around the world. Yeah. So we're very grateful that you are putting the time and energy into spreading the word. Thank you.
My pleasure, Jen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please.
Okay.